Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Janelle Blue, past president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, which is also the sponsor of this program. And today we're going to interview my co-host, Chuck Mason, and we want to talk about Scotland and researching in Scotland. And I know you have some Scottish ancestors, so tell us a little bit about how you go about researching in Scotland.
Well, I have two great-grandparents who came over from Scotland, and of course, people tend to think, okay, I've got to go to Scotland to do research. Before I got into genealogy, I made a trip to Scotland. Fortunately, I knew that when they left to come to Philadelphia, that they left from Glasgow, and my great-grandfather's father died when he was about 8 years old. And so the family lived outside of Glasgow and moved into Glasgow. And my great-grandmother's family was from Glasgow. So, like I say, before I got into genealogy, I made a trip to Scotland and went to Glasgow and walked around and probably walked down streets that they maybe lived on, but certainly walked on, but knew nothing. And one of the problems or the differences between researching in the United States and in England, Scotland, Wales, is the records are not as centrally located as they are here. We have things at the county, the state level, the federal level. Well, records for Scotland are in Scotland and in England, and depending on the time period. So you really have to know all of that before you can really begin researching. And of course, one of the other things is that it's a lot easier to find records here in the United States because we have records from Family Search and Ancestry, and we can access records from organizations like Scotland's People in Scotland, but from home. So before you plan a trip, you want to thoroughly know about your ancestors and where they lived and all that you can find out about them before you go to Scotland. Now,
So Chuck, how did you find out that they were from Glasgow?
Well, my grandfather, my mother's father, was their second oldest son. And of course, he talked about things.
Okay.
And, unlike my father's mother, who nothing jived. When I got into researching almost everything, I think the one big thing that I found was he always said his parents married the day his mother arrived in Philadelphia. And they didn't. They married the next day. There was a waiting period. And the other thing was he had always said his father had worked for about a year, sent money back to Scotland to bring her over. Well, he actually was here for 18 months when I finally found them. He was actually here for about 18 months before she came over, and they were married in Philadelphia. And then he talked about the rest of the family that came over and all. The one thing I found on my own and kind of found by accident was my great-grandmother had a younger brother who came over.
Oh.
And I knew nothing. My grandfather never talked about that, yet he lived 3 doors away from my great-grandfather's 3 sisters who came over. I found him on the census, like you should do with every census. Look at who else is in the neighborhood. And I'm looking, and 3 doors away is a Thomas Aird and his wife. And I thought, that's my great-grandmother's maiden name. And I looked into it, and it's her younger brother.
So there's a real story there.
So you really, you want to do all your homework and look at everything. But, my ancestors were not really common people. They really, they left their home, they left their family, they left jobs and everything else, possessions and everything, to come to the United States.
What year would that have been?
He came over, arrived the end of November of 1885.
Okay.
And she arrived June the 16th, 1887. And then they were married on the 17th of June in Philadelphia.
Did you find the ship's register?
Yes.
That's helpful, isn't it?
I found the ship's register. Wasn't an easy task, because one of the things that all of the work that I did was back before we had Ancestry. We did have some things on the family history centers where you could order microfilm, but Family Search didn't exist. And so I went down to the National Archives and I looked at the roll of film, and of course it was 16 millimeter film for the index, and they had a screwy way that they microfilmed things, because they microfilmed cards up one length of the film, and then you had to turn it around, and they came back. And you couldn't use it on a normal microfilm reader. You had to have one that magnified it, because on a normal reader, even putting it onto the screen with a magnifying glass, you couldn't read it. So it was a challenge.
They were testing you to see how serious you were about it.
They were definitely doing that. So you really want to know all that you can find out about your ancestors before you jump across the pond, as they say, to start researching.
Do you know, you said that they lived outside of Glasgow, so have you been able to identify where they live specifically?
Fortunately, yes, because my great-grandfather was born after they began civil registrations in Scotland.
Okay.
So I was able to find, he actually had two older brothers. He had an older brother that died as an infant, and for those who may not be familiar with Scottish naming patterns, usually the oldest son was named after the father's father.
Okay.
And the oldest daughter, the mother's mother. And then for like the second son, it is the mother's father, and the same thing for the daughter. So what I found was, I found a Hugh Peyton. I knew the oldest brother was Hugh, and I found a Hugh Peyton. And then I found a second birth record for Hugh Peyton with the same parents, and it's like, what's going on here? Well, then I went and I looked at death certificates, and I found that there was a death certificate for the first Hugh. And because there hadn't been another child born, or male child, they would rename the second child Hugh. So it was quite easy to find them. And then, of course, my grandfather, like I say, used to talk about the family. So he said that his father's father died when his father was about 8 years old, and his mother moved into Glasgow to support the family. I mean, they were living out in the country, so finding a job and being able to support family. And of course, she eventually remarried and had second husband and two daughters with the second husband. So there was the two boys, and then there were three girls that were born to my great-grandfathers.
Were there census in Glasgow at the time that you could reference?
Yes, there are censuses starting in 1801.
Okay, so and they named the head of household and everybody in it, or just the head of household?
They initially it was like the United States, where it was more statistical, and then eventually they got into naming everybody in the household.
So that's really helpful.
Yes.
As our census are here too.
Yes.
And what about the vital records? Have you been able to find any?
Yes, I've been able to look at vital records, particularly with Scotland's People's website.
Tell us a little bit about Scotland's People.
Scotland's People is an organization, kind of like Ancestry or Family Search, but it is a commercial site, but it's owned by the organization, and they have access to the records, and so it's easier there than to run around to the different places that records are located in Scotland, or down in London, because they flip-flopped back and forth where the records were actually kept, and so it's not cheap to get them, but it certainly beats the
cheaper
cost
than
of
getting
a
on an airplane
trip of going over there. If you only want one or two things, it's easier to do that or hire somebody. But if you really want to see things and have a lot, then it may be worth making the trip to go over there.
How did your grandmother survive once her husband died and she had children and she moved to Glasgow? How did she make a living?
Actually, the family was in the hosiery business, and so they were weavers and employed in the hosiery mills.
Okay.
And and that tradition continued down through the family. In fact, my mother and a couple of her siblings worked in the hosiery mills after they finished 8th grade. They all but her youngest brother, he went to high school, but the others, especially coming out of the Depression, hit 8th grade and you went off to work, and the next town over from where my grandparents lived was a big hosiery mill, and so they went to work. Some of them went to work there. My mother was one of the ones. She was the next to the youngest. Her youngest brother went to high school, but the others all finished 8th grade, and that was it.
So were they Presbyterian?
Yes.
So
the family was Presbyterian back in Scotland. In fact, I kind of surmise that that's how my great-grandparents actually met, because they were very active in the Young People's Organization and a music program in Presbyterian Church. And in fact, I have a couple of certificates where they attended like training sessions at conferences and things. And I have some other things from the Presbyterian Church. And they stayed Presbyterian until my great-grandparents retired sometime in the 1920s and moved down to Somers Point, New Jersey. And there was not a Presbyterian church in the town, so they switched to the Methodist Church. But my grandfather's oldest brother's family was Presbyterian down at least through all of his children. I don't know so much about his grandchildren, but all of the children.
So they came from Glasgow. Did they go to, in 1889, Ellis Island was there? No, they were not there.
No, they came directly from Glasgow to Philadelphia.
To Philadelphia.
And that's one of the things that you really need to know about, how the families came over, because in the case of my great-grandparents, they went from Glasgow to Philadelphia. If they had gone to another port, for example, I met someone years ago whose family was from Glasgow, but they went down to Liverpool.
Right.
A ticket from Liverpool to Philadelphia was more expensive than a ticket from Liverpool to Baltimore and then take a train up to Philadelphia. So her family went that way. Also, some cases it was cheaper to go into Canada and then migrate down into the United States. So you really need to look at all the possibilities and the options there, because they may or may not have come directly from Scotland to the United States.
So they landed in Philly, and then were they destined to go to New Jersey, or did they stay in Philly for a while?
They stayed in Philadelphia basically most of their life.
Okay.
They came over in 85 and 87, and they stayed there. And I should have looked it up, but I forget when it is. I've got a railroad bill of lading.
Ooh.
When they bought the land down in Summers Point and they were building the house. And I have a bill of lading where they bought materials.
Wow.
And I've got the date on that. And it was sometime in the latter part of the 1920s. And actually, that bill helped me to determine, because I have pictures of houses that are very similar. And some of them have 4 support posts and some of them have 3. Well, I know the ones with 3 are their house, because they bought 3 support posts for the porch, and they're on the bill.
My goodness.
But coming over, most of the family came over. The older brother, Hugh, stayed in Scotland because he was married, had children, had a job. My great-grandfather was 29 when he came over to Philadelphia and married.
Okay.
So, much later in life.
Yeah.
And then, as I said, or I think I said, his mother did remarry.
Yeah.
And so he had the older brother, himself, and 3 sisters. The 3 sisters eventually came over. His mother and stepfather came over, and the 2 half-sisters came over. So the only one left back in Scotland was the oldest brother. So they all came over to Philadelphia and basically stayed there until, like I say, when my great-grandparents retired. They built this house and then moved down to Summers Point. And the older daughter, who was typical of immigrant families, the oldest daughter stayed at home, never married, took care of mom and dad. So she moved, although she did work outside of the house after they moved to Summers Point, but she moved with them down to Summers Point.
So what do you think attracted them to Philadelphia? And did they just happen to land there and they decided to stay there, or was the plan all along to be in Philadelphia?
I don't really know. I assume that they heard something, somewhere along the way. They may have known someone, although I haven't found really any connections to anyone.
Is there a Scottish community or an area of town that?
Not really like other immigrants.
Yeah,
you
where
had Italian communities, Polish, German.
Right, yeah.
I don't really see where there's a big Scottish community there. So, but they came over and lived at 4 different addresses over time. And of course, the 3 sisters never married, so they lived together. And actually, early on, my great-grandparents lived on Ellis Street. And the 3 sisters lived on Ellis Street, and that's where I found my great-grandmother's brother 3 doors away. He was on Ellis Street. And at various times, the half-sisters also lived with them, looking at census records and also city directories, where people were living. The one half-sister did eventually go to Canada and was in Canada. I don't really know for sure how long, but she ended up meeting a man, marrying him, having a child, and they came back to Philadelphia initially, but then they moved to New Jersey. So I believe it's 1930 that I find them in the census in in New Jersey.
So did your original immigrant work in some sort of a factory or
Yeah,
hosiery?
as I say, the hosiery mills, the family, that seemed to be the major employment for the family. When they came to the United States, they started out in the hosiery mills. Some of them did go into other mills. One of the three sisters worked in a carpet mill as a weaver.
Wow.
And so
That would be tough.
Yeah, I'm sure that was a big change from weaving hosiery
Yeah.
to carpeting. And I don't know specifically what she did, but on the census record, one of them, it said that she was a weaver and in a carpet mill. And so one of the things that I played with was mapping out where the family lived. And that's a whole other lecture or program.
A different show, yeah.
But I went into the directories and the Sanborn fire maps. Well, there was only one carpet mill in the area in northeast East Philadelphia. So I'm reasonably sure, and it was like 2 or 3 blocks away from where she was living. I'm sure that's where she worked.
Yeah,
unlike
she could just walk to work.
Yeah, unlike the others where there were several hosiery mills or other types of mills. And of course, that's actually how my grandparents, my mother's parents, met. They both were working in the hosiery mills, met and got married, and my grandmother continued to work in the hosiery mill for a while. So
I've been to Scotland. The research I was doing was on names like Mackenzie and MacDonald and Ferguson and all of those there's a zillion of them. And now this has been a while ago, but we went to the Isle of Jura because somebody said that's where they were. We were so ill prepared. And it was a lovely trip, but it was not a genealogical research because we didn't even know what we were doing. So in the few minutes that we have left, what's your advice for someone who wants to research their ancestor in Scotland?
Really finding everything that you can about them, gathering every record that you can find about the individual ancestors, but also any family members that may have come to the United States, looking at what the other family members, how they may answer questions and all. My mother's maiden name and my great-grandparents, they surname was Peyton, P-A-T-O-N. Mm-hmm. My great-grandmother's maiden name was Wood, W-O-O-D. Her mother was McIntyre. That's the only MC family name that I've had. So that was kind of a little easier to find. But when I went to Scotland before I got into research, I thought, okay, Peyton, probably not that common a name. Well, when you go to various things in Scotland, museums and things, they often have a lot of books listing men who were in the military.
Yes.
Well, I started looking through one in one of the I think it was the castle in Scotland. Go through and find the Peytons, and it's like, chins in the Chinese phone book. There was page after page after page
like the Smiths.
Of Peytons or Smiths.
Yeah.
So it was a fairly common name, but I did have some knowledge about them, so it made it easier.
And of course, anybody who does genealogy knows that you really need to look at others, not just your focus person, but so many times the records for others might be different from the ones that you find for your focus person.
Right.
And so not only are the answers different, but the whole document could be different.
Yes.
And that might give you a clue in some way.
Yes.
Did you have any family letters or anything that you were able to?
No. Well, I shouldn't say that. Yes. I did have one copy of a letter that my second great-grandmother sent to my great-grandmother when she was still back in Scotland.
Oh, wow.
She had gotten sick. She was working outside of Glasgow, and she had gotten sick, and so her mother wrote her a letter. That ended up coming over with her. It was one of the few things that I did have, I did have a number of things from the conferences and like certificates that my great-grandparents attended these things with the Presbyterian Church, probably like the annual meeting of the Presbyterian Church kind of thing. So I have some of that, and of course, things that my grandfather told. I do know that at various times the three sisters went back to visit their brother and the family, but I don't have any indication that my great-grandfather or great-grandmother went back to visit.
So are you going to make that trip pretty soon?
Well, I was actually planning on it before the pandemic hit.
Yes.
And I hadn't finalized it, but the pandemic hit, and so that's
what's happened to all our trips.
I definitely want to go back because I know more now.
Yeah.
I still probably have some more research I should do before I do that, but I certainly will be better prepared than I was when I went back or went for that first trip.
Well, Chuck, this has been really interesting. Thank you for sharing this information about your family. And also, I know you teach some classes on Scottish research. And so I would invite everybody to check out Mount Vernon Genealogical Society. We've got lots of good training. We've got presenters every month. We have some special interest groups now. Go to that website that's on the screen, and we welcome your interest, and come visit or come join us. Thank you.